My homeowners association tried to tell me my federally protected service animal was against their no pets policy. They fined me, they harassed me every single day, and they dragged me into a legal nightmare that cost me my peace and my sense of safety in my own home. What they didn't count on? I document everything. And their illegal discrimination, their blatant disrespect for federal law, and their personal vendettas were about to cost them big time. This is the story of how my HOA picked a fight with the wrong guy and his dog, and how I made them pay for it. Before all this, my life was quiet. That's really the only word for it. After 6 years in the military, coming home to civilian life is an adjustment that's hard to describe unless you've been there. The world just feels loud, crowded, and totally unpredictable. I was diagnosed with PTSD, which for me means severe anxiety, being constantly on alert, and sometimes these completely debilitating panic attacks. It's an invisible injury. You can't see it on an X-ray, but it touches every single part of your life. Simple things like a trip to the grocery store can feel like climbing a mountain. The noise, the lights, the crowds. It was all just too much. I started retreating, isolating myself in my small apartment until the four walls felt more like a prison than a home. My therapist was the one who suggested a service animal. Honestly, I was skeptical. A dog? How is a dog supposed to help with something so internal? But then I met Apollo. Apollo is a 2-year-old German Shepherd, and let's be crystal clear. He is not a pet. He's not an emotional support animal either, even though he gives me plenty of it. Apollo is a highly trained service animal. It took over a year of intensive, specialized training for him to become my partner. He performs specific tasks that are critical for managing my disability. For instance, he can sense the tiny changes in my breathing and heart rate that happen right before a panic attack. When he does, he's trained to use deep pressure therapy, leaning his whole body against my legs or lying across my lap. That physical grounding is often enough to stop a full-blown attack in its tracks. In public, he does something called blocking, where he uses his body to create a physical bubble between me and other people, giving me the space I need to feel safe. He can get my medication. He wakes me up from nightmares. He is, without a shred of exaggeration, a living, breathing medical tool. He gave me my independence back. He gave me the confidence to actually leave my apartment and feel like myself again. With Apollo at my side, I felt ready for the next step, buying a home. I saved for years and finally found a small townhouse in a quiet, nice-looking community. It seemed perfect. It had a little yard and was close to a park where Apollo could run. It was run by a homeowners association, an HOA, which I didn't think much about. I read their bylaws and saw the standard no pets clause, but I knew my rights. Or, I thought I did. Under the Federal Fair Housing Act, a service animal isn't a pet. It's a reasonable accommodation, medical equipment basically, just like a wheelchair. An HOA can't legally deny a resident a service animal, regardless of their own rules. So, I bought the house. I sent the HOA board all my paperwork, including a letter from my doctor explaining my need for a service animal without going into the private details of my disability, as is my right. I moved in, and for a couple of months, everything was great. Apollo and I got into a routine. We had our morning walks, and in the evenings, we'd sit on the back patio. For the first time in years, I actually felt at peace. I let my guard down. I thought I was home. But that peace was just the calm before a storm I never saw coming. The first shot was fired in a crisp white envelope tucked into my mail slot, not in the mailbox, but placed there directly. A small detail, but it felt oddly personal, even a little threatening. Inside was a first notice of violation from the HOA. The letter was polite but firm. It pointed to Article 7, Section 3 of the bylaws about no animals being allowed. It said, "A large dog, identified as a German Shepherd, was seen on my property," which was a direct violation. It said I was being fined $100, and had to cure the violation, which meant get rid of Apollo within 2 weeks or face more fines. I read it 3 times. I was more confused and annoyed than anything else. I'd sent in my reasonable accommodation request. I'd followed the law perfectly. I figured it had to be a simple mistake. Someone just misplaced my paperwork, right? So I decided to handle it calmly. I copied my doctor's letter and printed out the part of the Department of Housing and Urban Development's website that explains the Fair Housing Act and service animals. I took a highlighter to the key parts. Reasonable accommodation, not considered pets, and unlawful to refuse. I wrote a polite letter of my own, explaining that Apollo was a service animal for a disability and that I'd already submitted my request 2 months ago. I attached the copies and sent it all by certified mail. I thought that would be the end of it. A week later, I got an email from the HOA president. Let's call her Brenda. I'd seen her around, always looking pristine, with a clipboard that seemed permanently attached to her hand. Her email was short and sharp. She said the board got my letter but had reviewed the bylaws and that the no pets policy is absolute. Then she wrote, and I'm quoting here, "While we appreciate your situation, making an exception would open the floodgates for everyone to claim their pet is a service animal. The board has denied your request. The fine stands, and we expect the animal to be removed." The floodgates? She was dismissing my federally protected rights as some kind of future inconvenience. Her tone was so condescending, her logic completely illegal. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. I took a deep breath. My training taught me to de-escalate, find a rational way forward. I decided to go to the next monthly HOA meeting. Maybe if I talked to them in person, they'd get it. The meeting was in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with folding chairs and buzzing fluorescent lights. Brenda sat at the head of a long table, with the other 4 board members on either side. I waded through a boring talk about sprinklers. Finally, they opened the floor for residents. I stood up, introduced myself, and calmly explained the situation again. I didn't talk about my PTSD. I didn't have to. The law is clear. The FHA and Americans with Disabilities Act say a housing provider can only ask 2 things. 1, is the animal required for a disability? And 2, what work or task is it trained to do? They can't ask what my disability is, so I answered both for them. Yes, Apollo is required because of a disability. Then I listed some of his tasks. He's trained to perform deep pressure therapy, create a physical barrier for me in crowds, and retrieve my medication. One of the board members, a guy who hadn't looked up from his phone once, actually snorted. Deep pressure therapy? You mean he leans on you? My golden retriever does that. That makes him a service dog? Brenda gave this tight, nasty little smirk. Thank you for your comments, she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. As we said in our email, the board's decision is final. The policy protects property values and the peaceful enjoyment of all residents. We can't have large, potentially aggressive breeds roaming the neighborhood. Apollo, who was lying quietly at my feet the whole time, didn't even twitch. He was the definition of a well-behaved animal. Her suggestion that he was a threat was just a flat-out insulting lie. He's not roaming the neighborhood, I shot back, my voice losing its calm. He's always on a leash by my side. He's a service animal, and you are legally required to accommodate that under the Fair Housing Act. Brenda's eyes narrowed. Sir, we are not debating this. You've been given notice. If the violation isn't cured, the fines will escalate. Next item on the agenda. I just stood there, stunned. The dismissal was so total, so arrogant. This wasn't about a law. It was about her power. I looked around the room. A few people looked uncomfortable, but most just stared into their laps, not wanting to get involved. I felt that old, cold dread creeping back in. The world was getting loud again. The walls were closing in. I turned, gave Apollo the quiet command to heel, and walked out of that room. The fight had started, but I had no idea how ugly it was about to get. That HOA meeting was just the start. It kicked off a relentless campaign of harassment that felt less about rules and more about making my life hell. It felt personal, with Brenda leading the charge. The official notices became a weekly thing. The $100 fine became a $200 fine for failure to cure. Then $500. They started inventing violations. I got a notice for improper landscaping because a patch of grass was a little brown. I got a citation for leaving my trash can out too long, even though I brought it in that same afternoon. Each letter was another attempt to intimidate me, another reminder I was being watched. The harassment wasn't just on paper. Brenda seemed to make it her mission to confront me anytime I was outside. If I was walking Apollo, her car would slow to a crawl as she passed, just glaring. She'd stand on her porch, phone in hand, pretending to talk, but very obviously recording me. It was constant low-level psychological warfare. One afternoon, I was in my backyard throwing a ball for Apollo. The yards are separated by these low fences with zero privacy. Brenda showed up at the fence with a neighbor I didn't know. She started talking in a stage whisper, just loud enough for me to hear. "You see," she said, "that's the dog I told you about, a German Shepherd. You know their reputation, so unpredictable. I just don't feel safe with it so close to the community pool." It was a blatant lie meant to turn my neighbors against me. Apollo was a model citizen, but she planted that seed of fear. Soon, I noticed neighbors crossing the street to avoid us. Parents would pull their kids closer. I was being turned into an outcast in my own neighborhood, all because of the HOA president's lies. The emails became a daily thing. Brenda sent rambling messages to the whole community about the importance of rules, with thinly veiled jabs at unauthorized animals and residents who think they're above the bylaws. She'd attach pictures she'd taken of me and Apollo on our walks, like she was documenting a crime scene. I kept responding to every notice with a certified letter, restating my rights under the FHA. I kept a detailed log of everything, every email, every fine, every confrontation. I put a security camera on my front porch. I felt like I was living under siege. The peace I'd worked so hard to find was gone, replaced by constant anxiety. My hypervigilance was back in full force. I was always on edge, just waiting for the next attack. The tipping point came on a Tuesday. I took Apollo to the little park in the middle of our community. We were the only ones there. He was on a long lead and we were just enjoying the sun. Suddenly, a county animal control van pulled up. 2 officers got out. My heart just sank. I knew exactly who called them. One officer walked toward me. "Sir, we got a report of a vicious and aggressive dog off leash in the park." I looked down at Apollo, who was sitting at my side, wagging his tail. "He's not aggressive," I said, my voice shaking a little, "and he's not off leash. He's my service animal." The officer looked from me to Apollo, and I saw him visibly relax. "Okay, sir. The report we got was pretty frantic. Said the dog was lunging at people." "We've been the only people in this park for the last half hour," I said. "Whoever called you is lying." Then I saw her, Brenda, standing on the sidewalk just outside the park, watching the whole thing. Phone out, of course, recording what she clearly hoped would be my downfall. The animal control officer followed my gaze and saw her. He let out this deep, tired sigh that told me this wasn't his first bogus call from a spiteful neighbor. "Is this an ongoing issue with your neighbor, sir?" he asked. "It's my HOA president," I told him. "She's been harassing me for months over my service animal." The officer nodded. He checked Apollo's license and tags, which were all up to date. He knelt, and Apollo gave his hand a friendly sniff and a lick. The officer chuckled. "Yeah, he seems real vicious." He stood up. "Look, there's nothing we can do here. The dog is leashed, licensed, and not a threat. The person who called this in filed a false report. That's a misdemeanor." He walked right over to Brenda, who was still standing there looking smug. I couldn't hear everything, but I saw her face shift from arrogance to shock, then to sputtering anger. The officer pointed back at me, at his notepad, and then tore a sheet off and handed it to her. A citation. She snatched it from his hand as he got back in the van and drove off. Brenda just stood there, staring at the ticket. Then she looked at me, her eyes filled with pure venom. She had tried to have my medical partner taken away from me with a lie, and it blew up in her face. That was it. That was the moment I knew polite letters were done. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a direct attack on my well-being. The fines were over $3,000. They were threatening foreclosure in emails. They had called the cops on me under false pretenses. The nightmare was in full swing, and I realized I couldn't fight it alone anymore. It was time to call for backup walking home from that park, with Brenda's hateful glare burning into my back. Something inside me just hardened. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with a cold resolve. She had crossed a line. Using law enforcement to try and take Apollo away was an attack I couldn't just absorb anymore. The time for defense was over. It was time to go on offense. That night, I was online for hours, but I wasn't looking for ways to appease the HOA. I was looking for lawyers who specialized in Fair Housing Act violations. I found a firm in the city with a rock-solid history of taking on HOAs and winning. First thing the next morning, I called them. I got connected with a lawyer, David. He was calm, reassuring. I spent nearly an hour on the phone with him, laying out the whole story, from the first letter to the animal control incident. I told him about my log, the letters, Brenda's emails, and the security camera footage. When I finished, there was a long pause. For a second, I was worried. Then David said, "This is one of the most clear-cut cases of harassment and FHA violation I have ever seen." I could almost hear him smiling. They didn't just fail to provide a reasonable accommodation, which is illegal. They engaged in a pattern of retaliation, which is also illegal. The president filing a false report with animal control, that's the nail in their coffin. They handed us a gift. That one conversation lifted a massive weight off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I wasn't alone. David laid out the plan. First, a cease and desist letter to put the HOA on formal legal notice. Second, a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or SHUD. Third, a lawsuit against the HOA, Brenda personally, and the other board members who sat by and did nothing. We wouldn't just ask for the fines to be dropped. We'd seek serious financial damages. "We'll seek compensatory damages for the emotional distress they caused you," David explained, "and punitive damages to punish them for their reckless indifference to your rights." My jaw just about hit the floor. A week later, the cease and desist letter went out. It was a masterpiece. 10 pages long, detailing every single violation, citing case law and federal statutes. It demanded they drop all fines, stop all contact, and issue a formal apology within 10 days, or the lawsuit would be filed. The effect was instant. The emails stopped, the notices stopped, the sidewalk surveillance stopped. It was dead silent. 10 days passed, not a word. On day 11, David filed the lawsuit. A few weeks after that, we got a letter from the law firm the HOA hired. The tone was different. They wanted to schedule a mediation to discuss a potential resolution. The mediation was at a neutral law office. I walked in with David, Apollo at my heel. On the other side of this giant table sat Brenda, the 4 other board members, and their 2 very expensive-looking lawyers. Brenda wouldn't even look at me. The smugness from the HOA meeting was gone. She just looked pale and nervous. David started by laying out our case, cool and methodical. He presented the timeline, played audio from my security camera of Brenda yelling at me, and showed them the citation she got from animal control. He stacked up the fines and threatening emails. Then, he presented a breakdown of the damages we were seeking, including emotional distress, punitive damages, and every cent of my legal fees. The room was silent. The HOA's lawyer cleared his throat. "My clients," he started, "were simply trying to enforce the community's bylaws. There was no malice intended." David just smiled. "No malice?" "Your client, Ms. Brenda," he said, pointing right at her, "lied to animal control to try and have a disabled veteran service animal impounded. That isn't enforcing bylaws. That is a malicious, targeted act of harassment. A jury will see it the exact same way. They'll also see that this entire board knew about it and let it happen, making you all personally liable." You could see the color drain from the faces of the other board members. That phrase, personally liable, hit them like a punch. Their lawyer saw it too. He and his clients huddled in the hallway for almost an hour. When they came back, the fight was gone. Their lawyer slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a settlement offer. This was it. The moment the power had completely and irreversibly shifted, they weren't in charge anymore. That first offer they slid across the table was a joke. They offered to waive the fines and pay a fraction of my legal fees if I signed an NDA and dropped the suit. David glanced at it, looked at their lawyer, and just shook his head. "We're not here to bargain," he said. "My client's life has been a living hell for almost a year because of what your clients did. They broke the law, they knew it, and they did it anyway. This isn't a negotiation. This is a surrender." Then he slid our counteroffer across the table. It wasn't a request. It was a list of demands. First, the HOA would pay a substantial 5-figure sum directly to me for the severe emotional distress their harassment caused. Second, the HOA's insurance would pay 100% of my legal fees. I wouldn't be out a single penny. Third, all fines were to be wiped from my record immediately. Fourth, the HOA had to issue a formal written apology, which had to be read aloud at the next annual meeting. Fifth, and this was David's idea, the entire HOA board, Brenda included, had to attend and complete a multi-day training course on the Fair Housing Act, conducted by a firm of our choosing on their dime. We wanted to make sure this never happened to anyone else. Sixth, the HOA had to rewrite its bylaws to include a clear policy for handling accommodation requests in full compliance with the law. And finally, my personal favorite, Brenda had to resign as HOA president, effective immediately. Their lawyer read the list, his eyes getting wider with each point. He whispered frantically with Brenda and the board. Brenda was shaking her head, but the others just looked defeated. They were trapped. Their lawyer knew that going to court would be a public and financial disaster they would almost certainly lose. After another tense huddle, their lawyer sighed. "We accept all terms," he said, the words tasting like ash. The feeling in that moment, it wasn't just relief, it was vindication. For months they'd made me feel like I was the problem, but in that room, the truth was finally on the table. They discriminated, they harassed, and now they were paying for it. A few weeks later, the settlement check arrived. The apology letter came soon after, a stiff, lawyer-approved document that was still a complete surrender. The bylaws were rewritten, and at the next HOA meeting, which I attended with Apollo sitting proudly beside me, Brenda's resignation was announced. I saw her in the back of the room afterwards. She scurried away, avoiding eye contact. The money was one thing, but the real win was the systemic change. It was knowing the next person with a disability who moves in won't have to go through what I did. Their rights are now written into the community's own rules. The nightmare was finally over. This whole ordeal taught me a couple of hard but valuable lessons. The biggest one is this: know your rights and don't ever be afraid to defend them. The law was on my side from day one, but a law is only as strong as your willingness to see it through. The Fair Housing Act isn't a suggestion. It's a federal law that protects people with disabilities. That includes the right to a service animal, and no HOA's no pets rule can override that. If you're in a similar spot, know what they can and can't ask. A housing provider can only ask 2 questions. Is the animal required because of a disability? And what work has it been trained to perform? They can't ask for your medical records or the nature of your disability. And they absolutely cannot demand certification or registration because no official universal registry for service animals exists. The second lesson: document everything, every email, every letter, every weird interaction. Keep a log, put up a camera if you have to. That evidence is what turns a he said, she said argument into a rock-solid case. My detailed records are what made our lawsuit so powerful. And finally, don't be afraid to get professional help. Fighting an HOA can feel like you're fighting a faceless giant. They have lawyers on retainer, Trying to go it alone is exhausting. There are law firms and nonprofits that specialize in this. A good lawyer doesn't just level the playing field. They can flip the entire board. My story had a good outcome, but it took a huge personal toll. The stress was immense. But standing up to bullies is never easy. My HOA, and especially its president, operated on ignorance and arrogance. They thought their little neighborhood rules were more important than federal civil rights law. They were wrong, and in the end, their ignorance cost them. They didn't just pay me. They paid their own lawyers, they paid for training, and they lost the power they so clearly love to abuse. My hope is that by sharing this, someone else might feel empowered. Know your rights, stand your ground, and never let anyone make you feel like your needs are just an inconvenience. Thanks for listening to my story. If you found this helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content. I really want to hear from you too. Have you ever had a run-in with an overbearing HOA? Drop your story in the comments below. Let's build a community where we can support each other and stand up to this kind of thing together.